The Hawthorne estate loomed before me, its Victorian architecture casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. For 10 years, I'd called this place home, lovingly restoring every inch of its historical grandeur alongside my late husband James. Now, barely 2 months after his tragic accident, I was being forced to leave. My name is Elena Chen, and this is the story of how I learned that some families will destroy everything to maintain their illusion of control. Mrs. Chen. Margaret Hawthorne's voice cut through my thoughts as I reached for the brass door handle. How kind of you to finally join us. I stepped into the grand living room, where the family had gathered for what they were calling an estate settlement meeting. Margaret sat in her late husband's leather armchair like a queen on her throne, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression a masterpiece of practiced disdain. The room held memories of happier times, holiday gatherings, summer parties, quiet evenings with James in front of the fireplace. Now it felt like a courtroom, with Margaret as judge, jury, and executioner. "Elena, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We've been discussing the future of the estate. Given the circumstances, we feel it's best if you find other accommodations. Immediately." I looked around the room. Thomas, James's younger brother, avoided my gaze, suddenly fascinated by his Italian loafers. Cousin Richard examined his manicured nails. Only James's sister Catherine met my eyes, her face a mixture of shame and resignation. "The circumstances?" I kept my voice level, though my heart raced. "You mean my husband's death?" "Let's be frank," Margaret continued, setting down her tea with precise movements. "You and James were married for what, 8 years?" 10, I corrected quietly. 10 years during which you convinced my son to pour money into renovating this house rather than investing in the family business. 10 years where you slowly isolated him from his proper social circles with your different background. The prejudice in her voice was barely veiled. To Margaret Hawthorne, my Chinese-American heritage had always been an unforgivable flaw in her son's choice of wife. "James loved this house," I said. "We both did. Every renovation was his choice, his vision." "Yes, well," Margaret's lips thinned. "The house belongs to the Hawthorne family, and now that James is gone, there's no reason for you to remain here." I thought of the hidden letter in my purse, received just last week from Herbert Morton, the family's longtime lawyer. "Actually, there might be something you should know. The deed is in the Hawthorne name," Margaret cut in sharply. "Our lawyers have reviewed everything. You have no claim here." I studied her face, seeing the slight tension around her eyes. She was worried about something. In 10 years of careful observation, I learned to read the subtle signs of Margaret Hawthorne's concerns. Furthermore, she continued, pulling out a thick folder. "We've documented every questionable expense, every renovation cost that exceeded the approved budgets. The board of the Hawthorne Foundation is prepared to launch a full investigation into potential misuse of family funds." Ah, there it was, the threat she'd been building to. "You wouldn't want that kind of scrutiny, would you, Elena? All those contractors you hired, all those decisions you influenced James to make. It would be unfortunate if the authorities had to get involved." I thought again of Herbert Morton's letter, safely stored in my safe deposit box along with other carefully collected documents. For 10 years, I'd watched the Hawthorne family operate, seen how they wielded power and privilege like weapons. I'd learned their methods, their patterns. Most importantly, I learned from James about the family's darkest secrets, the ones that kept his mother awake at night. "Of course not, Margaret," I said softly. "I'll pack my things." Her smile was triumphant. "Wise choice. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Everything else, of course, stays with the estate." I stood smoothing my skirt. "Just to be clear, you're asking me to leave my home of 10 years, abandoning any claim to the estate, under threat of legal action." "Nobody's threatening anything," Thomas finally spoke up, his voice weak. "It's just better this way. Cleaner." I nodded slowly. "I understand, though I wonder what James would think of this." "James isn't here," Margaret snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "And we all know why, don't we? All those renovations you pushed for, all that construction. If you hadn't insisted on him being so hands-on with the work." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. They blamed me for James' accident, for the collapse of the old greenhouse we'd been restoring together. But they didn't know what I knew about that day, about the mysteriously weakened support beams, the missing inspection reports, the hurried cleanup before the insurance investigators arrived. I reached for my purse, my fingers brushing against the copy of Herbert Morton's letter. But no, not yet. Timing was everything, as Margaret herself had taught me through years of social manipulation. "I'll need a few days to pack," I said. "You have until Friday," Margaret replied. "The security team will supervise. We wouldn't want any family heirlooms to accidentally find their way into your boxes." I walked out of the living room with my head high, past the family portraits lining the hallway. James's smile beamed down at me from a dozen frames, his eyes kind and determined. He'd always said his family would show their true colors eventually. "Just wait," he told me during one of our last conversations. "Everything will become clear after the reading of Dad's full will. Promise me you'll be patient until then." I promised, and now, as I climbed the grand staircase one last time, I smiled slightly. Because in 3 days, Herbert Morton would finally open George Hawthorne's complete will, including the sealed amendments only he knew about. Margaret thought she was orchestrating my exile. She didn't realize she was setting the stage for her own downfall. In my bedroom, I began carefully packing away 10 years of memories. Photos, books, the jade pendant James had given me on our first anniversary. Through the window, I could see Margaret in the garden, directing the gardeners with sharp gestures. My phone buzzed. A message from Herbert Morton. "Everything in place for Friday. All parties notified. Stay strong." I looked around the room that had been my sanctuary for a decade, remembering James's words the day we moved in. "This house has secrets, Elena. Dad made sure of that. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." The time was coming, and I knew exactly what to do. Friday morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of George Hawthorne's study. I sat quietly in the leather armchair where I'd spent countless evenings with my father-in-law, discussing history, architecture, and his beloved estate. "You understand preservation, Elena," he told me once, his eyes twinkling. "Not just of buildings, but of legacy. That's why James chose you. That's why I chose you too." At the time, I hadn't understood what he meant. Now, watching Margaret Hawthorne sweep into the study with her entourage of lawyers, I finally did. Herbert Morton sat behind the massive oak desk, his bow tie slightly crooked as always. The family lawyer had served the Hawthornes for 40 years, watching 3 generations navigate power, wealth, and betrayal. "Now that everyone's here," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "we can proceed with the final reading of George Hawthorne's will, including the sealed amendments made 6 months before his death." Margaret's perfectly manicured hand tightened on her purse. "Amendments? I wasn't aware of any amendments." "No," Herbert said mildly. "You weren't. That was by design." He opened a thick envelope, removing several documents. "Before we begin, I should note that everything here has been verified by 3 independent law firms. The authenticity is beyond question." I washed Margaret's face carefully. There it was, that flicker of fear she always tried to hide behind aristocratic disdain. "George Hawthorne's last amendment to his will," Herbert continued, "concerns the ownership and management of the estate itself. While the Hawthorne Foundation retains certain rights, the primary deed and operational control of the property transfers to—" He paused, looking directly at Margaret, "Elena Chen Hawthorne." The room erupted in chaos. Thomas jumped to his feet, spluttering incoherently. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of purple. But Margaret's reaction was the most striking. She went completely still, her face draining of color. "That's impossible," she whispered. Herbert held up a hand. "There's more. Mr. Hawthorne left a letter explaining his decision. Shall I read it?" Without waiting for a response, he began. "My dear family, if this letter is being read, then the events I feared have come to pass. Margaret, my beloved wife, your ambition has finally overcome your judgment. You've likely already moved to exile Elena from her rightful home, using the same tactics you employed against others who threatened your control of the family legacy. But Elena is different. I chose her as the guardian of our true legacy, not the facade of power you've worked so hard to maintain, but the principles of preservation, integrity, and justice that built the Hawthorne name. I've watched her work tirelessly alongside James to restore not just the physical structure of our home, but its spirit. She understands what you never did, that true legacy isn't about control, it's about stewardship. To my children, I love you, but your mother's influence has corrupted your judgment. The recent accidents at the estate, including the tragic loss of James, bear striking similarities to past incidents that were quickly buried under layers of legal settlements. Elena, my dear daughter-in-law, you hold in your hands now not just the deed to the estate, but evidence of decades of financial manipulation, covered-up accidents, and corrupt dealings. Use it wisely. Herbert set down the letter. There are several attachments detailing specific instances of misconduct, including, he glanced at his notes, the tampered support beams in the greenhouse where James Hawthorne died. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's composure finally cracked. You can't prove anything, she hissed. Those records were destroyed. Were they? I spoke for the first time, opening my laptop. James and I kept copies of everything. Every inspection report, every modification order, every hasty cleanup directive. Your mistake, Margaret, was assuming I was just the quiet foreign bride who didn't understand your world. I turned the screen to show security footage from the day of the accident, footage showing Margaret's trusted maintenance supervisor deliberately weakening the greenhouse structure. James knew, I continued softly. He discovered the pattern of sabotage, the way you eliminated anyone who threatened your control. That's why he asked his father to amend the will. That's why we documented everything. The police have already been notified, Herbert added. They're particularly interested in similar accidents over the past 2 decades. Margaret stood up, her aristocratic bearing crumbling. You can't do this. We're family. Family? I felt a cold anger rise in my chest. You blamed me for James's death. You tried to destroy my reputation. You threatened me with false accusations. That's not family, Margaret. That's tyranny. What do you want? Thomas asked, his voice shaking. I closed my laptop slowly. Justice. For James, for everyone else your mother has hurt. The estate will become what it should have been all along. A preserve for history and art, open to the public. The Hawthorne Foundation will be restructured with transparent oversight. And if we refuse, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, then every document, every video, every piece of evidence goes to the authorities. Your choice. The next few hours were a blur of signatures, legal declarations, and thinly veiled threats from Margaret's rapidly diminishing legal team. By sunset, I stood alone in George Hawthorne's study with Herbert. You played it perfectly, he said, gathering his papers. George would be proud. James too. I touched the jade pendant at my neck, thinking of James's smile, his unwavering faith in justice. They knew, didn't they? Both of them. They knew it would come to this. Herbert nodded. They knew Margaret would show her true nature after James's death. They knew you were the only one strong enough to stand against her. 1 year later, the Hawthorne Estate Heritage Center opened its doors on a perfect spring morning. Hundreds of visitors wandered the restored grounds, admiring the architecture, the gardens, and the new museum dedicated to local history. Margaret had retired to a distant cousin's estate in Europe, her carefully constructed empire of fear dismantled by the truth she tried so hard to bury. Thomas and Richard had signed agreements relinquishing their roles in the foundation in exchange for immunity from prosecution. I stood in the restored greenhouse, now a magnificent conservatory filled with rare plants and historical exhibits. A plaque honored James's memory, not as a victim, but as a visionary who believed in preserving beauty and truth for future generations. Catherine, the only family member who'd supported me, now helped manage the estate's educational programs. You've created something remarkable, she said, joining me by the koi pond. This is what the estate should have been all along. My phone buzzed. A message from our new head of security. Another Hawthorne property had been discovered. One Margaret had kept hidden for years. More secrets to uncover, more truth to preserve. I smiled, touching the wall James and I had rebuilt together. Want to help me restore another piece of history? Catherine grinned. Always. That evening, I sat in George Hawthorne's study, my study now, looking through old family photos. James beamed from every frame, his eyes full of the same passion for preservation and justice that had drawn us together. You were right, I whispered to his image. Everything did become clear after the will reading. And look what we've built from the truth. The setting sun painted the room in amber light, warming the oak panels James and I had restored by hand. Outside, the last visitors strolled the grounds, taking pictures, making memories, enjoying the beauty we'd fought to preserve. Margaret had tried to cast me out, thinking she was protecting her family's legacy. Instead, she triggered the revelation of its true inheritance, not the power she'd hoarded, but the principles she'd abandoned. Now the estate stood as a testament to a different kind of legacy, not one of control and fear, but of preservation and truth. Every restored room, every open door, every shared story was a quiet victory over those who would bury the past to maintain their power. James would have loved it. George too. Their vision finally realized through the very qualities Margaret had scorned: patience, dedication, and the quiet strength to stand for what's right. As darkness fell, I locked up the study and walked through the grand hallway, now lined with historical photographs and educational displays. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more stories, more opportunities to build something meaningful from the ashes of deception. The jade pendant caught the last ray of sunlight, reminding me of another lesson James had taught me. True revenge isn't about destruction. It's about transformation, taking what others would destroy and making it into something beautiful. That's exactly what we'd done with the Hawthorne estate. And that, more than any legal victory or public vindication, was the sweetest revenge of all. The end.